Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Let's Talk Willowdale. This is the fourth in our series of virtual town halls this spring. Tonight's discussion is going to be around public spaces for vertical communities, and we are very happy to have you joining us this evening. We've had a great run of conversation so far, and happy to have another great conversation tonight with another great panel of individuals joining us. Before we kick off, I want to acknowledge the land we are meeting on and discussing is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So with us tonight, once again, is our City Councillor, John Filion, representing Ward 18 Willowdale. We have Natasha Moes-Chandler with us, who is a member of our local Parks Advisory Committee. And we have Nigel Carvalho, who is representing SmartDensity, a planning firm in the city of Toronto. In the background tonight, you may hear from Jesse James, who is our community outreach operative in the councillor's office, and Nicole Hausman, who helps to manage our public space files in the ward. So what we are going to be talking about tonight is our growing neighborhood and how to best make that growing neighborhood as livable as possible. Some of the previous town halls we've been doing have been talking about new types of housing, either multiplex housing or affordable housing. And of course, the key theme that, during the affordability crisis that we are struggling with currently, especially, there is general acknowledgement that we need more housing right across the city. But housing alone isn't going to be enough. I think we all want more than just a place to live. We want a great neighborhood to live in with wonderful public spaces, parks, amenities, libraries, childcare centers, all of that sort of stuff. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about what makes a great livable neighborhood and how we can achieve that as the neighborhood continues to grow. What are the things that we should be looking at, and what are the tools that we should be talking about? Our government's currently getting it right in terms of their policies, in terms of matching these things together. What are the things that you should know about, and what are the things that we all should be advocating for as members of this Willowdale community, particularly as there are some changes happening both at the provincial level in terms of legislation and some discussion that's going to be coming to City Council over the next few months about how the city is going to respond to some of that changing legislation. But to kick things off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just start with a minute or so of introduction to introduce themselves and some of the thoughts that they are bringing to this conversation tonight about public spaces for vertical communities. So why don't we lead off with our Councillor, John Filion. John.
Thanks, Markus. Well, you summed it up very well in your introductory comments, but certainly in the time that I've represented Willowdale, it has gone from being a place that had few high rises to being a place where about 2/3 of the population, 2/3 of the people I represent, live in high rises. And it's really important that our office stay in tune with your needs and have a way of delivering that, delivering programs to you and services to you and capital projects to you that you need. I'm stating the obvious, but if you live in a high rise, if you don't have a backyard, public open space becomes, very important to you. Having access to a community center is very important. Excuse me. And it's not something you can do for yourself. You need to rely on your local government to provide those things for you. So it's really important that we get it right, that we are able to create enough parks and just as importantly to make the best use of what we have, because we don't have a lot of parkland in the area, that it has a rapidly increasing population. So we have to be really smart with how we use the space so that it serves as many people as possible. So glad to hear a lot of ideas from you tonight on how best to do that.
All right. Thank you, John. And also with us tonight is a resident in the community, parent, living in a local condominium. So exactly sort of the target audience and somebody representative of the sorts of folks that we want to speak to and speak about tonight. But Natasha Chandler's also been working with our Parks Advisory Committee to sit down with other residents in the area and start plotting some of this stuff out. So we're glad to have you with us, Natasha. Any thoughts that you have as we kick off this conversation tonight? We're going to get you off mute, I think.
Okay, we have had a little problem with her audio. So I think what we're going to do is have Natasha leave and come back again, and perhaps we can go to Nigel.
All right. That sounds like a good plan. Jesse will work with you on the back end. Natasha will figure out how to get you back on and even possibly have you call in parallel with your video if need be. The ongoing challenges of trying to get this figured out in a virtual space. But we also have with us tonight Nigel Carvalho with the firm called SmartDensity. So seemed to be a great organization to invite to the table tonight to talk about this from the planning side of the equation. Some of the concepts that are out there, best practices in terms of trying to figure out how to marry public spaces and denser communities together. So welcome, Nigel. Any thoughts that you have as we kick this off?
Hi. Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, I work for SmartDensity, which is an architecture and urban planning firm that focuses on creative designs for densifying Toronto and promoting inclusive communities with like a vibrant urban environment. So I feel like that's something that you guys are looking for. My lens is particularly from the angle of new residential development and its relationship to the public space. I know that you had a housing meeting previously, but I think that I can offer some insights. Hopefully it doesn't overlap too much.
All right. Well, we're glad to have you with us. And as we're working on bringing Natasha back to the fold here, I may start just asking you a couple of questions, Nigel, to sort of dig down a little bit on a little bit further on smart density and sort of the role that you play. So tell us about what the firm does, what your role is, in terms of having these conversations about the relationship between new residential development and public spaces.
I mean, smart density is, yeah, as you mentioned, very aware that the housing crisis us fixing it does depend on us having more housing, but it's very easy just to throw new housing up very fast wherever it can go, but that doesn't really lead to communities that thrive and are enjoyable to live in. So we really focus on creating buildings, but also ensuring that buildings where we put the buildings are like near things like public transit, have the amenities, surrounding amenities and main streets to support that kind of development. And when we do, a big part of my role is when we do have a client, we just sort of do a study of what really is available in the community to support the type of density that we're putting in.
All right. And so from your perspective, I mean, when you're doing that kind of look, what kind of features are you looking for? What makes a livable community from your lens?
I mean, for me, it has a lot to do with many of the things you've discussed. So yeah, like schools and childcare are a big one that I'm always looking at, but also access to public space. And if that isn't there, ensuring that we're including that within the development, because there's a lot of ways that you can create amenity spaces that work, particularly for families. We focus on too, because Toronto has a big lack of housing for families in new developments. So making sure that units are family friendly, but also that the amenities within the development, especially if there isn't a lot of green space or public space around, can be used by children or also seniors as well, but making sure that the amenities within a building will actually be used, because so often amenity spaces and buildings just go unused.
So that's really interesting. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about some examples of amenity spaces within buildings that are being well utilized by families? Perhaps some examples of things that you've seen that are, particularly innovative or creative, that have helped sort of take the pressure off of other recreational spaces in a community?
Right. Yeah, you put that really well. Taking the pressure off other recreational spaces and leaving those people who like don't have those in the building. It's a great way to put it. But I think a big one is the way that basically the composition of the building and where you're placing the larger units where families live. And so ensuring that those are closer to the bottom floor, where hopefully you've included some sort of playgrounds or green space on the actual property for children, but making sure that they're close by those units that are actually going to be housing families. Also, often condos have like, the kind of like party room that people like don't really use. I feel like that's maybe going out of trend now, but when I lived in a condo, there no one ever used it. So turning that into sort of a space for youth, like to, for instance, do homework, or yeah, something that actually serves a purpose beyond just like an empty room that you're supposed to party in or something. Yeah. I found that those, yeah, like I haven't talked to too many youth that live in those buildings, but the ones I have spoken to say that they use it fairly often. Especially during COVID, it was pretty imperative during that as a way to like get out of your not necessarily small, but condo unit and do your homework.
All right. Thank you for that. One of the things I was, Natasha's coming back online here. I was hoping to sort of tease out early on is just sort of getting a description of the experience of a parent living in the community, trying to access recreational spaces and do that. I'm going to give her just a minute as we seem to be getting her back online. John, I'll jump to you. I mean, this has been sort of an area that you've been focused on, right back from the early days of the North York Secondary Plan. Seeing density coming into this neighborhood, not always with a plan that you would have considered adequate to make sure that all of these facilities are added in. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced over time, trying to make sure that the parks actually appear as they're supposed to, or that childcare centers are actually coming into this neighborhood where the growth exists? What are some of the historical challenges that have existed in this community in particular?
Well, it's been sometimes it's funding, but that hasn't been too bad up to now. It won't be so good in the future, and I'll get to that a bit later. The difficulty is sometimes finding the space. So with parkland, for example, the policies are kind of okay, but currently the section in the Planning Act that governs parks allows you to require parks on site, and you can either take a percentage of the land for a park, or you can get cash. The problem with those two things is the parkland on site, because most of our development sites are along Yonge Street, they're very compact. And if you take the parkland on site, it is typically very small. If you take the cash, you don't necessarily get parkland with it, or you only get parkland with a portion of it, and the other half gets kind of scattered throughout the city for various purposes. So fortunately, I've been able to work with the park staff and with a lot of applicants, the cooperative applicants, to try to create parkland offsite. And even though there's no requirement, you can't make somebody do it. But a lot of times we can say to an applicant, how about you take the 10% that you are required to give us in cash and go and purchase that property, or go and purchase these two properties. And pretty much all of the new parks we've been able to create have been through that way of doing it, not necessarily because the legislation encourages it, but because if you get a cooperative applicant, you can kind of maneuver it that way, and that's what we've been able to do.
So you've touched on one of the key revenue streams. There's a principle in municipal planning that growth should pay for growth. That as you have more development happening in a community, there should be resources to resources made available to add to services, making sure that those services exist for the people that are coming in. You've talked about the parkland dedication being one of those key revenue streams. City also has a tool in development charges, and then we'll talk about what used to be Section 37 in a moment. One of the big challenges, I think, for parents in the neighborhood, and I'm going to get Natasha to touch on this in a moment, is around childcare. Nigel touched on it, schools as well, but schools fall outside of the city's sphere of influence. But in childcare centers, the wait lists in Willowdale have been, years long for a long time. Development charges is one of the tools that the city uses to create new childcare centers in the city. With the growth that's happened in Willowdale over the last 20 years, 25 years, how many new childcare centers have appeared in Willowdale from development charges?
A lot, mostly not from development charges, though, mostly through Section 37. And I've lost count, but I would say, we've built, I don't know, maybe six or seven childcare centers. But I think only one of those was using development charge money. It was all Section 37. And in fact, the province has now prohibited collecting development charge money for childcare. At the same time as they have in Willowdale, in any case, slashed the amount that developers need to contribute, have basically gotten rid of the Section 37. So there's no money there for childcare anymore either. And then the other factor is, even if there was some other source of funding, like the federal government, who has introduced the $10 a day in cooperation with the province, which is going to greatly increase the demand. So logically, the federal government will create some capital funding to build childcare centers, but where are you going to put them? Unless you have a new school being built and you incorporate it there, you really need a cooperative developer to do it. And in recent years, I have found it increasingly difficult to find anybody who's willing to put childcare centers in their buildings. So it's going to be a big problem in the future, both how we going to pay for it, and even if we had the money, where would we put them?
So I just want to unpack what you said, because I think there was a lot in there that was really valuable information that residents may not be fully aware of. I think we're all anticipating with the new childcare agreement that there will likely be more demand for childcare. Right across the province, right across the country, most likely. Historically in Willowdale, this has been a challenge, finding adequate childcare spaces to meet the existing demand with the growth. Development charges has been a way for the city to pay for them in the past. That's no longer an option. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, it's one of the quote unquote soft services that the provincial government has excluded from the development charge bylaws. So you can't collect for it anymore. So you can't use development charge money to build childcare centers because you can't collect it for that purpose.
So what that leaves you then is what used to be known as Section 37 funding, which is now going to be known as community benefit charges. You touched on getting less community benefits charge funding moving forward. Can you talk about that for a moment?
So in Willowdale, and it's not the same all across the city, but in Willowdale, the we will be getting about 2/3 less than we used to get. So the money that used to come in that we used for childcare centers and playgrounds and a whole lot of other community services like that is dropping by about 2/3. So, you know, it's going to be a real problem going forward as we add a lot more population, which we both need to do because we need to provide housing for people, and we literally have to do because the province is requiring us to.
And so the likelihood is, you know, the city right across the board is going to have to become a lot more creative with how it comes up with these solutions moving forward.
Well, sure, you always need to be more creative, but you kind of can't get blood from a stone. You know, you know, unless we're able to print money, we're going to have a problem doing it, no matter how creative we are. But you know, you can. I suspect that Nigel has some. It sounds like his clients are on the cooperative side of the line. With a cooperative applicant, you can get a lot done because they can build a childcare center for a lot less than the city can. I'll give RealCan a plug. You know, at the Shepherd Center, they agreed to build us a childcare center and a family resource center. The city owns it and will own it for 99 years. There are no taxes to be paid on it. There is no utilities to be paid on it. And so we are able to run some terrific programs for families out of there because we had a cooperative applicant, and they got a credit towards what was their Section 37, which will become CBC. But it didn't cost that much because they were already completely renovating their building. So they only really had their incremental costs and were good enough to basically just pass on their incremental costs to us. And we were able to get some great facilities, and I'm sure it helped them market their buildings. So, you know, it can work for everybody where you have people willing to cooperate.
And so, Nigel, from your perspective, you know, with some of these changes that we've been talking about, has that changed the complexion of the discussion that you're perhaps having with clients in terms of trying to figure out how to make their buildings, their neighborhoods work as a collective?
I haven't had any of those discussions quite yet. One that does relate, though, is that we often do push for rather than having a big box realtor or retailer coming into the bottom, like the ground floor of a building, we'll push for smaller local businesses, but that requires the developer to agree to having basically smaller units, retail units, and that is often less lucrative for a developer to do because it requires less management, and it's just easier to have a larger retailer come in, but I've even had a hard time sometimes convincing people just to have a small retail space. So the idea of trying to convince a developer it's difficult to ask them to put in a community space when it doesn't really bring them much back financially.
All right. I want to get Natasha in here. She's persevered. I'm hoping we're going to be able to hear you now. But initially, I kind of wanted to set the stage just to get your perspective as a parent in the neighborhood. You know, we've talked about childcare. We haven't talked about sort of parks and recreation yet. But you know, what are some of the challenges that you have seen, you know, with your kids and just finding spaces for them in and around the neighborhood?
Yeah, thanks so much. I moved to Willowdale about 6 months before the pandemic began, and so my experience has been influenced by that. And I think the pandemic probably brought to the forefront things that I might not have otherwise noticed. But we definitely, so I'm a mom of 3 kids, 6 and under, and so we put a huge value on being able to use park space and access rec centers and things like that. And so all of these issues definitely stand out to me as a person living in Willowdale in a small condo with 3 kids. In terms of childcare, it's something that we've personally tried to find and had a hard time finding. And so, yeah, I definitely have seen the need for more childcare spaces. And yeah, even just last week, I finally got off the wait list a year later for a space that I had been waiting for my daughter, and we didn't end up finding something for her. So, yeah, these issues definitely hit home for me and for so many other families like us. I know that in my son's school, which is quite far from our home because of the density around our neighborhood, most of the kids come from high density buildings, and so that does impact the way that we get to school, the way that we move around the neighborhood, and what we need in a neighborhood. So I'm grateful for this discussion.
All right. So, one of the reasons that you're here is because you've been working with our Parks Advisory Committee and discussing, from a parks and recreation perspective, some of the features and sort of additions that might benefit the neighborhood as a whole. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, sort of some of the themes that group has been exploring. Are there any ideas that have come up that have kind of gripped the group, things that you want to bring forward?
Yeah, I guess one thing from that group that has been a conversation that we've returned to again and again is the idea that different demographics use parks in different ways, and that parks need to work well for everyone in the community. And so people in condos use parks differently than people who have a backyard where they can, host and do their own thing. But also seniors use parks in different ways than young families do. And so it's been really interesting with that group to hear about different features of parks and the conversations that drive the improvements that are made to parks. So even today, I was with my kids in our local park, and it's been repainted over the last week, and it's been so helpful. So a small improvement like that can make a huge difference for the people using playground equipment and things like that. So hearing from the Parks Committee about the way that those improvements are planned with the specific demographics in mind and the different needs that they're trying to address has been really interesting. I think the other thing in that group that's come up again and again is that there's pockets of Willowdale that don't have good access to park space, and trying to think of creative solutions for helping people gain access in ways that benefit them to parks when there really isn't one close by their home.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what John was talking about a little bit earlier on about trying to creatively get off-site parkland dedication to assemble new parks in the community. John, do you have an estimate of how many parks that you have managed to assemble over the last several years?
It's kind of like the childcare centers. I've lost count, but for a while we were doing one a year of each, so there was, I think, about certainly 6 or 7 years where we were opening a new park each year. Some of them were, decent size. Some of them are pretty small. In some cases, it's a strategic piece of land that opens up a park. On Ellerslie, for example, we purchased one large lot, which then opened up Abbotsford Park to that community because it was a fantastic park, but was somewhat landlocked. So with that one key property, we were able to make that much more available to the community, and at the same time put in some Section 37 money to build a fabulous new playground. So that's a real example of a success where without a lot of money, you really accomplished a lot. So we need to keep doing a lot more of those sorts of things, be pretty strategic with our land acquisition.
And I know over the last couple of years in particular, there's been a lot of discussion about Yonge Street, north of Finch in particular, a new secondary plan that's being developed for that area. You've been thinking a lot about parks and facilities to service that new community, and I've got a few projects that have been sort of bubbling away for a little while now. So we got to sort of the doom and gloom in terms of the less money part, but Can you talk for a couple of moments maybe about some of the new projects that residents are likely to start seeing over the next couple of years?
Yes, well, there's some great opportunities up there, so which we've acted on. So one, with the redevelopment of Newtonbrook Plaza, there will be a large new park to the just to the east of that development, which will be available both to the people who are living in those condos and just people who live in the neighborhood or even who live on the other side of Yonge Street. We're also building a community center as part of that development. So two great features for new residents. Over on the other side of the street, we have the Inez development, which just went through council week before last week, I guess. And that includes a 2.5-acre park. And we're currently, I think, close to wrapping up negotiations with another applicant next door that would be about another 2.5 acres. So we would get a new 5-acre park there, which for Willowdale is massive and will really help transform that area up there. You know, I'm already kind of thinking about what we can do with a property of that size. And, I think it will be terrific for people living nearby, but for the whole community. For example, I hope we're able to put in an artificial ice rink, an artificial like hockey rink, because we have, I think, 5 groups now that are operating outdoor natural rinks in the winter, but boy, that's getting tougher and tougher with climate change. And to have, an outdoor artificial rink similar to what some other parts of the city have, and then to be able to use that space for other activities when you take the ice out, I think that's going to be a real asset. So we really need to involve the community and think about how we're going to use that space and make sure we have a lot of activities and but also a lot of just space to sit and read a book and just enjoy time with friends.
So Natasha, coming from the Parks Advisory Group, I'm sure you've been talking about some ideal new features that you might like to see in our park system locally. I'm sure hearing about a new 5-acre park site, we'll have some of those committee members licking their chops. But what are some of the items, the ideas that perhaps have been discussed at that table about features that would really be a great benefit, a great add to the Willowdale community? John's talked about the possibility of an artificial ice rink. Are there other things that have come forward through some of your discussions?
Yeah, I think, well, I've only been part of the group during the pandemic when gathering outdoors was something that was a necessity, but I think that continues to be something that people look for. So gathering spaces, seating where you can sit outside and study with a group, space where you can enjoy a meal with people, so picnic areas. I know that there's also a high demand for off-leash dog parks, especially for people who don't have a backyard and need a place where their dog can run around. And so I think there's an interest in the community for that. Whether this is the right space for that or not, I don't know. But I think, like I mentioned, parks need to work well for so many different people, and having a big space like that probably gives a lot of options for being able to include features that serve all sorts of different demographics. I know I live pretty close to Edithvale, and the outdoor workout equipment there is used by a demographic that I think has really benefited from having that outdoor workout space. And so maybe something like that is helpful for, just people in the community looking to stay fit and stuff.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely in line. John didn't get a chance to mention the project ongoing at Willowdale Park right now, which is another one in close proximity to a lot of high rises, and Section 37 money that's being invested there to significantly expand the playground, create a picnic area. And that was some of the feedback as well in terms of multi-generational considerations and things like fitness equipment to make that kind of a park space work for multiple generations. You've also touched on one of the hot button issues in the area for a long time, which is off-leash areas. John, you and I have done a fair bit of work sort of looking at feasibility in local parks and trying to figure that all out. Do you want to talk about that for a moment? Because that's probably something we hear about almost more than anything else in terms of park features, trying to figure out the right space, not only for residents of different ages, but our fuzzy friends in addition to ourselves.
Yeah, well, it's a challenge. Being a dog lover and a dog owner, I can certainly recognize the need. Up until now, it's been really difficult finding kind of the right park. We don't have a lot of large parks like you do in the parts of town that have a lot of the really good off-leash dog areas. And it's just been hard to figure out where to put one in. But we've been looking at a few spots, and certainly having a new 5-acre park will certainly open up some opportunities there. I forgot to mention, we're also this will be a few years away certainly, but with the redevelopment of Centrepoint Mall, which will be happening over a very long period of time, we will be getting a very large park in the middle of that site. So that's another large one in a very urban area, kind of surrounded by high rises, but again, with enough space to be pretty creative and to try to put a little bit of something in for everybody. And the adult exercise equipment that Natasha mentioned, that's a really good example of it takes very little extra space. It's just, and it's an example of something that came from the community. I remember we were talking about improvements to Gwendolyn Park, I guess it was maybe 5-6 years ago, and doing some community consultation. And the community members that came out said, well, it's great doing things for the kids, and we should do something for the kids, but what about something for the adults as well? And we were kind of like, what might be available? I hadn't really thought about it till the idea came from the community, and we did some research and we came up with some really good equipment there, and have been trying to incorporate the same into a lot of other parks ever since.
All right. John, we've touched on a couple of times Yonge Street North, the Centrepoint site, some of the other big development that's already sort of getting underway up there, and probably a lot more to come in the years ahead as the subway is extended north. We've talked about some of the changes to funding and some of the concerns and challenges. Council is going to be looking at the new community benefit charges this summer, I believe, trying to sort of figure out how to set up its system. One of the big questions I think that's on the table is whether some of the money that's collected in that new program will be anchored locally. So Section 37 money, which had to be spent within a close proximity to where it was generated, that's not in the provincial legislation for community benefits charges. Is that something that you think council's going to look at? Is that going to be an important consideration?
It's something I'm quite worried about because, you have parts of the city that you have 26 members of council, including the mayor, and, there's only about 5 or 6 that have really large amounts of development. So, in the majority could say, hey, we want this money spread out and not necessarily used in the community from which it originated. And it originated, of course, for the purpose of meeting the needs of the new residents. So that would be a big problem if that happens. And there are a number of other problems associated with the new legislation as well. One, of course, is that we'll be getting, as I mentioned, about a third as much money as we used to get. But the fact that we may then have trouble even getting that back to Willowdale. And there's also a requirement that 60% of it has to be allocated to a specific project each year. And, things just kind of don't work like that very well. An opportunity comes up and you have to be able to jump on it. And sometimes we talked about childcare earlier. So you have a developer who's willing to include childcare, but you need to provide some of that money and have it come back to that site. Not always easy to do under the new rules. Or I'll give the example of Edithvale Community Center, where I literally held on to money for 12 years in the Section 37 pot for Willowdale in order to put together $10 million to build that, with the city kicking in another 5 from development charges. So a good thing we built when we did that. We were able to build that for $15 million. Today, I'm sure it would be double that only 10 years later. But, it's going to be a lot harder to do those things in the future. And I'm very concerned about that.
So I've got to follow up. Just a reminder to our audience, we're going to turn it over to you in just a moment. So if you have questions or comments, you want to get in on this conversation, ask one of our panelists a question, or just provide your own thoughts, you can raise your hand, look for that icon on the right-hand side of your screen, or use the Q&A box to type something in if you don't want to do anything live necessarily. So coming back, John, to the question of what council is going to be looking at, are there things that you think that the city needs to do this summer when council is looking at this question to try to get this right?
Yeah, although we are very hamstrung by the provincial legislation. I mean, the first thing I would say is tell the province that they need to make changes to their legislation so that we can hopefully get, they promised that growth would pay for growth. Well, under their formula, it is not. So stick to your promise and allow us to get enough money so that growth does pay for growth, rather than have, the taxpayers as a whole have to pay for all of the new facilities we're going to need for the new population. But just, be more flexible with the rules around it. Like I asked, for example, well, can we create an envelope that says childcare, and we'll put money in there and then pull it out as needed? And the staff said, no, you'd have to say a specific childcare at a specific location on that envelope. So just makes it really difficult. So, I'll be trying to do what I can within the legislation to try to bring in as much money as I can, as quickly as I can, and still have it allocated as much as possible to Willowdale.
And Nigel, coming back to you, sort of from the planning perspective, I don't know if this is sort of a process that you've been keeping an eye on, sort of through the work that you're doing. Do you have any thoughts in terms of some of the changes that have come down in terms of how cities, what revenue tools they're going to be given, whether the province has got it right, things that the city should be looking to do this summer when it's discussing community benefits charges, from the perspective of smart density, and government policies that would support it. What would you be looking for?
Well, for me, I think it's like usually a bit upsetting when there is so much provincial oversight and municipalities aren't allowed to basically develop policies that are best suited for their local needs. So I've found following this to be like pretty disappointing. I would definitely say that.
All right, fair enough. And Natasha, is the legislative side something that's on your radar at all as a resident or a parent? I mean, my gut is that these changes haven't really landed with people living in the community at all. People aren't really aware of what's happening. Would that be accurate with people in your social circles? Do you think people are aware of these changes that are happening with their governments?
I think you're correct that most of us are not following these things, and it only comes to our attention when we can't find a childcare spot for our kids, or we can't, get our kid into swimming lessons because there's not enough community recreation spaces and things like that. That's what brings this into reality for the average resident in the area.
For sure, for sure. Okay, I'm going to start looking for hands and questions. I'm not sure that I see any that are up yet. So once again, I'm going to poke our audience that are listening along here. I know many of you have your own thoughts about this issue and things that you might like to see in the community. So here's an opportunity for you to raise your hand, click that icon, put something into the question box. I'm going to double check with Jesse if he's seeing anything right now, and if not, I'm going to make him ask a question.
No, we do have one question that's come in to me. The question is there an amenity or a park recreation asset that's missing in Willowdale that needs to be brought here that isn't here yet?
Natasha, I'm going to throw that to you first.
Well, in my personal opinion, I think zip lines are missing in Willowdale. My kids often ask if we can drive to one of the big parks in the suburbs that has zip lines in the playgrounds. But more seriously, I live pretty close to Hendon Park, and on Saturday nights in the summer, the splash pad is completely overrun with people because I think that water features in parks aren't as common in Willowdale as they are in other parts of the city, partly because in the downtown and east end, you have wading pools as well. So splash pads are the kind of alternative up here, and there's only a few in Willowdale. And so I would say there's pockets of Willowdale that don't have something like that for cooling off in the summer. And if you live in an apartment that doesn't have air conditioning, things like that are really important. And so I would say that's one maybe a minor recreation feature that I think could be added in a few places that would make a big difference for people.
I'm trying to remember. I'm going to throw this to Nicole. I don't know if she's up on this. Was a zip something that we were considering at Willowdale Park in terms of the expansion?
We were definitely looking at the zip line, and I think presented it in our consultation. But I think in terms of size and space limitations, it didn't make sense. But it's definitely something to consider for future park developments and in other areas.
It goes back to that challenge of how many really large parks we have to accommodate something like that. But I know the landscape architects are going to be starting to work on that design soon based on our first consultation. So an invitation to everybody on with us tonight to keep an eye out for the next consultation where we get a chance to take a look at the designs that they've come up with and offer some more feedback. John, I'm going to throw that question to you in terms of a missing feature in Willowdale, something that you would really like to see added to the community.
Well, there are some things we don't have any of, and I mentioned one earlier, which is an artificial ice rink. And I think that's important just because it's getting increasingly difficult for the volunteers to do the natural ice rinks. And there's something great about just being able to go out and play shinny with, kids playing with other kids, or, parents teaching their kids how to skate, or how to play hockey, in a just kind of natural way, that you don't have to join a league for, you don't have to pay any money for, and winters are pretty long when you don't have those types of activities. So I think we could really use that. We could use a really good toboggan hill. We don't have one of those, although I don't know we have the natural features for it. We could use a dog park because we don't have one of those, and then there's lots of things that we don't have enough of because they're in such demand. Natasha mentioned one, which is any kind of water play. I'd also say basketball courts, are really in high demand, even though we've put several in. That's more of those needed. A lot of things that, what's kind of common with a lot of those is that they kind of open up the outdoors to you doing things that you maybe weren't able to do previously, and they don't cost you anything. It's, we really need things that people can do outside with their families or by themselves that, that is very easy for them to do, easy for them to access. You don't have to drain your pocketbook because it costs so much for everybody just to live in the city these days. So, all of those, and I'm sure there's several more. Really interested in hearing those. Really interested in hearing examples of elsewhere in the world. What's worked well there. I know when I visit other cities, I'm always really interested in visiting the parks and seeing if there's any great ideas that we can borrow.
All right. And on that, Nigel, I'm going to repackage this question for you a little bit because you may not be as familiar with sort of local amenities in Willowdale specifically. But thinking about Toronto as a whole, are there any types of park features or public amenities that you think the city as a whole would benefit from seeing more of?
Well, I actually have liked a lot of the suggestions that have come up because they do integrate winter uses. I feel like a lot of the time in Toronto, we just are sort of waiting around for the spring and summer, and the parks don't really get used enough. So these suggestions of the toboggan or the skating rink are really great. I also think of I did my undergrad in Montreal, which is even more cold than here. And it's not necessarily an activity, but something that I thought they did really well was just lighting in the winter. Like the parks look beautiful just to walk around, and you're so much more inclined to use public spaces and use parks just for a jaunt in the evening when it's dark out, when it's lit beautifully. And I feel like that's something that could easily be done in Toronto just to make winter more enjoyable here in our public spaces.
All right. Jesse, we've got a few more questions coming in. I'll throw it back to you. Jesse, do we have you? You may be on mute.
Oh, sorry, I was
There we go.
muted and speaking so eloquently.
I can't see you, so I didn't know if you were even speaking.
Apologies. The question is about creating a network of parks. Would it be possible to identify several key parks that have either large features or attractive features, and then finding a way to create a connected roadway, pathway, continuous sidewalks or bike paths between these parks, and thereby generating a kind of neighborhood connected park system that encourages people to meet and rotate from park to park and go throughout the neighborhood.
John, I'm going to throw that over to you first. Any thoughts on connected parks?
Yes, a great concept, and it's been a big disappointment to me that we haven't been able to do more of that in the area from 401 up to Finch, just because there was no planning done. Like at the time that the former City of North York Council decided to create a downtown at Mel Lastman's behest, and there was a lot of good features with that, but parks were kind of an afterthought, and like as if they would just magically happen and happen in the right locations and be connected. And of course, things don't turn out that way if you don't plan for them. So we now have buildings in places where you would naturally have made those connections in that area. In Young North, which is the new redevelopment area stretching from Comer up to Steeles, I am trying to do that as much as possible to create a community that people can get around by bicycle and walking paths, and to have parks and community centers and like variety of them that kind of can link up that way. So, you know, from pretty much from Edithdale Community Center, although you have to cross the street, but you know, through Hendon Park and traveling up north through you'll hit the the 5-acre park. You'll hit Goulding Community Center. You'll hit the new parkland that'll be in Center Point Mall, and I would very much like to see all those properly linked up so you could travel very easily from one to the other without having to get in a car, and the kids could go from one to the other safely without having to go out onto a main street or cross a main street.
Terrific.
Jump in with
yeah, go ahead.
Just from the Parks Advisory Committee, one project that we worked on last year is an inventory and a map showing the amenities available in each park. And so I think Nicole can probably connect you once that's available. But that'll be publicly available, and it'll at least give you an idea of what's available in each park. And so it doesn't say much to the networks between them, but it'll help the community to understand where different amenities can be found.
And I was going to jump in. There had been ideas floated around the Willowdale Park project. And Glendora Park is another one that's on the radar for a few years down the line. And of course, Glendora, Willowdale are connected through the linear park to Lee Lifes and Art Park. And our new BIA on Yonge Street, I think, is also starting to take an interest in branding themselves with an arts focus, recognizing we've got the theater in the neighborhood, two of the big art schools in the city that are sort of all in that area, and whether there is more opportunity to sort of do some public art in some of these places and create a linkage sort of through that trail system as well. So a few good ideas that have come online, and I think we need to keep exploring as a community, sort of how to create those adventures, right? To sort of find interesting things in local parks that get you out and moving around, as John's talked about. Jesse, let me go back to you.
All right. So we have a few comments and questions. Let's go to the first one. This is from Donna Owens. First is a comment. Stats Canada census data from last year is showing that there is an increasing population of seniors. What are the plans and designs for parks and public spaces, especially considering that there are many, many seniors living in condos that keep this population in mind? Thank you.
So let me start with Nigel on this. You talked about repurposing some of the spaces, communal spaces in condos for youth. Are you aware of sort of similar designs or concepts that are being integrated for seniors in the context of some of these facilities?
Yeah, well, I think a big one that we're trying to focus on with clients is creating lobby spaces that are actually places you want to be. So places and like shared spaces throughout a building. So places that in many condominiums you just pass by and they're fairly large. They have some seating, but no one really spends time in them. But sort of designing them in a way that makes them inviting and makes them a place that you would want to sit with your family for a little bit of time or see your neighbors. And yeah, using these shared spaces to socialize and to exist in rather than just places that you pass through, I think is a big one for seniors.
And John, from your perspective, I mean, we've talked a lot about sort of multi-resident, sort of multi-generational spaces in parks and shifting the focus in that direction. Are there other concepts that you've come across that might be a little more senior-centric in terms of public spaces?
Not really. I'm certainly open to suggestions. I think, we have talked about that, we should design our parks for all generations to be able to use at the same time, like so that, grandparents bring their grandchildren to the playground and have a comfortable place to sit while they're watching them, or Natasha had mentioned earlier, like being able to picnic, like to have three generations of the same family together, outside on a beautiful day, sitting at a nice big park bench, having a picnic. Those are the things that naturally come to mind for me. Programs, of course, in community centers, but would be very interested in any thoughts on what Donna or anyone else would have on, how we might do a better job with that.
Yeah, and I know there are other organizations in the community that are looking more at that as well. I think of the North York Senior Center, for example, that was working on a pilot to get in and animate some of those perhaps underutilized party rooms that Nigel was talking about early on, to create programming opportunities for buildings where you have seniors communities that are looking for activities in those sorts of spaces. Jesse, let's go back to you.
All right, next question it would be from Linda Poirier. So first a comment. There's land around our condo that's not being utilized by residents, and I'm trying to persuade our condo board to fence it in to serve as a small dog park for pets in our building. Would city staff consider drafting guidelines for condo boards, space considerations, rules, etc., to help nudge them to renovate their outdoor spaces for this use? And then perhaps the city could find a small pool of funds to incentivize condo boards to take this initiative. Thank you.
John, any thoughts from you on that?
Just that it's a really good idea. I've never heard it mentioned before, but it's a terrific idea. And, first, of course, you'd have to get your condo board on board, so to speak, to want to do it. But, if somebody wanted to do that, if we knew that this was a real thing that could happen, I would certainly try to get park staff to, give some advice, provide some, information on what works well and what doesn't in relatively small city-owned dog spaces, kind of some do's and don'ts. And, if we had the Section 37 money we used to have, then probably having the city kick in a bit for something like that might be possible, but much harder to do when we're going to be getting a third as much money, and there's some very fundamental things like childcare that we're not going to be able to afford to do.
Nigel, have you encountered any creative solutions to dog spaces in projects that you've been involved with?
Not quite. I find that mostly developers just kind of want to rely on the community outside of the development for that. Like, it's something that is really, lots of dogs are being brought into the neighborhood, but yeah, there's not, I haven't seen I haven't been a part of a project where that is something that's a huge consideration, unfortunately, and I wish it was, because yeah, we have to support the dogs too in these neighborhoods.
And I think John and I have found that a lot more creativity is required, sort of amongst city staff and beyond. I think in terms of drafting guidelines, they exist for parks, and what they would tell you for a park is they want a minimum, very large amount of space, to the point that it's almost impossible to get one meeting the city's requirements in any of our local parks, because our parks aren't all that big. So you get something in the Hydro Corridor, on Bayview Avenue, for example, that works. But otherwise in North York, you've got stuff going in at Ross Lord Park and some of those larger green spaces. It's harder to meet those requirements in small city parks, and I would imagine small condo green spaces. So that's the creative challenge, I think, that we have, and seeing how many people have been gaining new members of their family, four-legged members of their family through the pandemic period. This is becoming a much bigger issue that we're going to have to look for creative solutions for. Natasha, did you go out and get a dog during the pandemic? Is that part of your list of challenges, or the little ones enough for you?
Our home is pretty full at this point, but I was gonna say our condo actually has a what I believe is a fenced dog run in the condo yard. So I would suggest that it probably is possible. I don't know much about it because I don't have a dog and I haven't seen people using it very often, but if that inspires or gives hope, I think it maybe exists.
We may have to pick up this conversation offline, because if there are some best practices along those lines to share, Lyndon may be very interested, and it would be very interesting to create perhaps a gathering of local condominium boards and members to have that conversation. I think there are a lot that would be really interested in fleshing that out. Jesse?
Yeah, we have another question from Donna Owens. She makes a great comment about how McKee Public School playground, and I might add as well the turf soccer field, is just packed on weekends and evenings. She says she lives across the street from it. I live down the street from it. It is packed. She's right. So she asks the question, how do school boards come into the discussion around community infrastructure, parks, and recreation?
I'm going to throw that to John, who has dealt with that challenge a number of times over the course of his career.
Yes, so we have tried to do some cooperative things with the school boards. Sometimes they've worked out well, other times not so well. The difficulty is, even when we had the Section 37 money, which, as I've said before, is going to be very scarce, but it's really supposed to be spent on community projects. So ones that I've considered in the past and allocated money towards is, if it's going to be something that's available both to the school kids and to the community after hours, and I guess McKee's an example of that, although I don't think there was any city money that went towards that playground. But at St. Edward's, for example, I think the city paid for more than half of the playground. And with that thinking that it is a community benefit, and as long as the school board is, willing to encourage that use outside of school hours, that works out great. We did a smaller project at St. Cyril's, a small project at
Yorkview.
Yorkview. Yes, thank you, Jesse. So and those have gone well. And we can do some of those still, but again, the difficulty is when we have only a third as much money as we used to have, we really have to spend that first on community centers and childcare centers and city playgrounds. And, if there's a way to combine resources with the school boards, then I'm glad to do that as well. And they are also starved for funds, I will add, in some ways worse than the city is.
I was going to say, I mean, one of the big challenges is that the schools themselves are very squeezed, and you get into sort of a catch-22 situation. McKee being a good example, where there isn't enough classroom space for kids at that school. They end up putting portables out in the schoolyard, and a big chunk of the available play space, recreation space in the most dense areas end up having that limited space covered by portable classrooms, and you lose space because of that. So it's a real challenge trying to figure out how to strike that balance, and better utilizing that space for the whole community, much as was the case with childcare, and integrating more childcare centers into our local schools, which you had a lot to do with, John. Okay, I think we've got one more question, Jesse.
Yeah, one more question. Willowdale is home to not just a large ravine system with the tributaries to the Don on the east and the west sides, but it also has a very significant hydro corridor with a recreation trail. Might there be good uses of or partnerships with the TRCA or the whoever owns the hydro fields to create even more engaging, interactive parks and recreation facilities where currently it's just either a path and a big green space or it's paved over for cars?
All right. I don't know who wants to tackle that one. Probably we'll throw it to you first, John.
Well, I'm going to say I've sort of delegated that to this great resource in my office named Markus O'Brien-Fehr, who's been working on it and actually knows a lot more about it than I do. Certainly, I'm very encouraging of that. Sometimes TRCA is difficult to work with, but certainly for good reasons. They're trying to protect the ravines, but there are some projects that I'm certainly very interested in, such as next to the Bogart Apartments, where I've set aside some of the Section 37 money to provide kind of an easy way into the ravine from that community and for the new residents who'll be moving in there. If we can get the TRCA to buy in, and we still have to have those discussions. And I know, Markus, I'm going to toss it back to you, just because even though you're the moderator, you've also done a lot of work on this.
That's fair, and there have been some conversations, even very recently, with the Parks Advisory Committee taking a very strong interest in this. Trying to figure it out. Certainly on the surface, it makes sense given our limited green space to try to capitalize on what's there. From a policy perspective, we get into muddy territory very quickly. It's actually operated by Hydro One, not TRCA, so it's got nothing to do with the city. And they are often very reluctant to allow sort of permanent structures coming into that space that might interfere with hydro moving through. There's also been some recent advice, relatively recent advice from Toronto Public Health, being mindful of electromagnetic fields created by high voltage power lines, that it may not be a space that people want to be hanging out for really long periods of time. So the city tends to be more enthusiastic about things like multi-use trails, where you sort of move through the area rather than some place that you're going to be camped out. That having been said, for things like off-leash areas, I think from the Parks Advisory Group, there was the notion of a frisbee golf sort of feature, and perhaps looking at something along those lines. And we are looking at putting together a large discussion with various stakeholders, which would include, sort of hydro, city, or provincial and local representatives, as well as community stakeholders to have some of those conversations. And then on the ravines, John's just sort of flagged me, and I apologize if I sort of got off track with the wrong topic. There is certainly opportunity to look at trying to connect trails through some of those spaces as well. Did I mishear, Jesse? Were we talking about ravines in that question?
Ravines and the hydro corridor, because they're actually connected right across
Right.
from the east to the west.
Right.
Yeah, perfect.
Absolutely. So I would say as well on the ravine side, one of the big question marks is sort of the long-term use of the Don Valley Golf Course, sort of coming into Hogs Hollow. And the city recently has been looking at expanding off-season uses for the golf courses and perhaps figuring out how to use some of that land to better connect trails through the neighborhood. So that is something that's being actively looked at to connect some of the trails through the Hinder property, Bathurst Park, some of the West Don trail lands down into Hogs Hollow, and perhaps eventually a cycling network on Yonge Street itself. So there you go. Both sides.
Sounds very exciting.
And now that I have done my spiel, I think that gets us to a point where I'm going to invite our panel to throw out some closing thoughts on what we've talked about tonight. Anything else that any of you want to add to this conversation? I'll give you a couple of minutes each to take the floor and provide some closing thoughts. I will go in reverse order, so I will start with Natasha.
Thanks. I guess the last thing that I wanted to share maybe has to do with the way that we communicate about what's available in neighborhoods and what people might want to access. And I think of my next door neighbors in our condo who don't speak English as their first language, and who are seniors and have struggled to access certain things because they just don't know it exists, and they don't know where the trails are, and they don't know. They didn't know about Edithville Community Center, and so they were really excited to find that there are seniors that, play board games there sometimes, or at least did pre-pandemic. And so I think there's a need for really clear communication with people, especially who might really need these resources and amenities in their communities, and so helping them get connected well through whether it's the councillor's office or other online or print platforms. I think that's really important. And then, as was mentioned so many times tonight, creative thinking about how we address needs for a whole bunch of different demographics, a whole bunch of really unique situations and unique uses of recreational features and parks and things like that. I think Willowdale is in a unique position to need to be really creative about these things as the neighborhood has grown so much. And so it's an exciting time, but there's also, I know, a lot of pressures to get it right and to do it in a way that works well for everyone.
All right. Thanks, Natasha, and thanks for being with us. Nigel, over to you. Any sort of closing thoughts that you have in terms of public spaces and vertical communities?
I mean, right now I'm just kind of thinking about how what you've organized here tonight is a great way of sort of doing it right, because I feel like making sure that councillors are aware of what residents want in their neighborhoods is key to all of this. Like just collecting community benefits funding or Section 37 funding, whatever, isn't really enough unless residents are sort of organized and having these discussions in a collaborative way. So I think this is a great way of facilitating that. So, well, good job there. Because I feel like, yeah, when I'm walking through some of Toronto's neighborhoods, I'll see things that I can assume have been built or have, involved CBC funding, but I'm never really sure if, or sometimes I am sure that it doesn't really reflect like what people were looking for. So I think it is important that people are here today and will be engaging with you in the future to make sure that their voices are heard on the topic. So well done, everyone, for that.
All right. Well, Nigel, again, thank you for giving up your evening to be part of the conversation tonight and
No, it was really interesting. I enjoyed myself. Thank you.
providing your perspective. It's been great. And John, over to you for some final thoughts.
Yes, well, with the way housing is going in Willowdale and throughout the city, green space and publicly funded and publicly owned facilities, whether it's a park or a community center or lots of other examples, become really, really important because it's not only are people living in high rises without backyards, but the units keep getting smaller and smaller. Recently, I've had a developer go to the Ontario Land Tribunal, where all developers go to get pretty much anything they want, has gone there to have a number of units doubled in their development, which is mostly within the same size building. So they are pretty much cutting all their units in half the size that they were planning only a few years ago. And some of the one bedrooms were less than 300 square feet. There was something that was billed as a 3-bedroom unit that was about 750 square feet. And maybe there's a market for that because it's all people can afford in Toronto now, and better to own your own 300 square feet than nothing at all, and people have to make those choices. But if you're living in those small units, the world outside your building just becomes so much more important to you. And we really have to do a really good job at understanding what those needs are and providing them. And I think we probably have residents who've joined the meeting tonight who live in high rises, as Natasha does, and has chosen to get involved through our Parks Advisory Committee. It's really important that we hear from you because otherwise we might miss an opportunity. You don't get that many opportunities to design a new park or even to redo a park. It comes along every 25 years or so, and we really need to hear from the people who live in the area. That's where most of the good ideas come from. So just thanks for taking part tonight, and please stay involved and encourage your neighbors to get involved.
And John, I think you've summed it up well. I mean, we all know that housing is absolutely critical and is front of brain for a lot of people that are struggling, trying to find a place to live. Lots of changes coming right across the city and to this community, and as you've touched on, that's going to mean more pressure on all of these public spaces and features and amenities. I think that all of us on the call tonight agree. We want a great neighborhood to live in, and a lot of these features that we've talked about tonight is what makes a neighborhood a nice place to live your life and spend your time and be with family and friends and all of that sort of stuff. So we've clearly got a lot of work to do, but it only happens well when we have an engaged community and those that are able to share in conversations and help guide that future. So John and Natasha and Nigel, again, thanks so much for being part of this conversation tonight. To Jesse and Nicole in the background for supporting, and of course to the participants tonight for your questions and for just being part of this conversation. It will continue over the next little while, and I hope you will all continue to be engaged with it as we move forward. So with that, we're going to call it a wrap tonight. Thanks very much for being part of it. Again, I'm Markus O'Brien-Fehr saying good night.